Welcome to our first Anywhere JS. I am Josh Owens, and today we have with us Chris Nelson, my JavaScript mentor.
Oh no.
So if I suck at JavaScript, it's his fault. That's not true at all. If I suck, it's because I suck. All right. So yeah, here is just very simply, I suck at getting down to like Cincy JS, and I know some people like don't always have uh, a good meetup around them. So I thought, why not do something online? And some of it was kind of based off the idea of CreatorConf, but I didn't really like charging for that. So I just tried to rethink like how could we do this as a free thing that the whole world can enjoy, and this is kind of what I came up with. And then I actually had an interaction with Ken Wheeler, and he was like talking about how it sucks that people get rejected from conferences. I actually think you shopped this talk around to a few places, Chris. Is that right?
I did. I gave it at one conference, but I definitely got rejected from others. So both.
Yeah. Yeah. So I thought this would be a fun way. Like people can watch the talks, and people that are interested can give these talks. And, hopefully we get a wide variety of people that have given a lot of talks, some people that are brand new to giving talks. So, and it gives you an opportunity to like also practice. So that's always a good thing.
Yep.
All right. So, without further ado, I will turn it over to Chris. He's going to share his screen. He'll go through the talk. If you want, you can leave comments on the YouTube channel, or you can tweet to me at Josh Owens, and we'll save the questions for the end. I'll be keeping track of them, and then we'll have a little Q&A when the talk is over. So, have at it, Chris.
Okay. Well, I'll start by sharing my screen. And I'll just share the whole thing. All right. Are you seeing that okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. I'll embiggen the slides a little bit until I get to the demo portion. So yeah, thanks everybody for watching, and thanks Josh for letting me give this talk again. This talk kind of started from kind of a little impromptu Cincy.js talk, and then I kind of expanded it a little bit and gave it a conference here in Cincinnati called Momentum. But basically the idea kind of started with kind of an experiment that I set for myself. And it was really around the idea of, do we really still need web frameworks, or really kind of like, what would it be like to actually try to develop a web app without using any kind of web framework, and how did it feel, and what did I learn? So those are the main things I'm going to try to be talking about. My name's Chris Nelson. I'm the co-founder of Gaslight. We're a web and mobile development company here in Cincinnati. We also run an apprenticeship program, which Josh is also a mentor for, where we welcome brand new people into the field of software development, people that have learned to code either kind of self-taught or going to a boot camp or something like that, but need that first job to really launch themselves into their career. And that's something that we do. So if you're interested in that, absolutely feel free to hit me up after the talk. But what we're talking about today is my experiments with developing a web app without a framework. And I'm going to start with kind of a look back in terms of my experience with web app development and with web frameworks. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I would love to have as in my idealized future for web app development. And then I'm going to share some ideas and experiences for how I think we can get there with stuff that's available today, which I think is pretty exciting. So just to start, the title's a little, I don't know, deliberately controversial and all that, but I'm not really here to hate on web frameworks. Really, I've had a lot of fun building apps with web frameworks, and I feel like the ideas that I've seen in different web frameworks have definitely moved our industry forward in a really good way. I think the first web framework that I really had a lot of project experience with, at least, was probably Backbone. And Backbone really gave some nice structure to, what before was just kind of wads of JavaScript scattered all over the place. And that made building more interesting apps just a lot more manageable and better. After probably working with Backbone a year or two, as Angular, the first version of Angular started to mature, and I started experimenting with it, I really fell in love with Angular, the first version, Angular 1.js. And the thing I loved most about it is its component-oriented approach. I really felt like working with components was a really good way to get better levels of reuse in web app development. And that idea that I feel like Angular kind of pioneered really has made building web apps a lot better. And then after Angular, in full disclosure, not entirely voluntarily, I started working with React.js. And I don't say I was initially super enamored with it, but as I really got to know the ideas of some of their ideas about one-way binding and things, I've really come to appreciate the ideas around state management that React kind of pioneered and gives us. So I kind of said some of these words already, so I'll kind of whip through the slides, but some of the good ideas that I really feel like web frameworks have given us. Reusable components, I feel like, is just an excellent idea for organizing a web framework. And then, yeah, this idea that I kind of first saw in React, but definitely other frameworks like Ember were talking about it too. Ember calls it actions up, data down. Dumb components is another way to look at it, one-way data flow. But basically the idea is I have data flowing down into my components through props in the case of React, and then I have events coming out of my components and going up, and then something else is managing that state. So yeah, there's definitely some good ideas that we've gotten from web frameworks, but I gotta say personally, I've become really tired and kind of worn out with the framework treadmill, I guess. And really where I feel like the framework treadmill is really hard to take is it's not so much that new frameworks come along, but the fact that they are generally completely incompatible with the frameworks that came before. It really makes it a hard pill to swallow. Even if there's some there's always a good next thing. It always has great new ideas, but man, after going through a couple of them, going from Backbone to Angular and then Angular to React, it's like, man, do I really want to start over again and throw away all my code and rewrite? And I don't know. It's just it becomes less attractive. Maybe the older I get, maybe I'm getting a little old, and I just want all these kids to get off my lawn and stuff. But yeah, what really though is the deal for me that I'd really like to see if we could stop having incompatible frameworks, and if there's something new, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. And really, for me, as I look back over my history with web app development, there's some things that for their time were really, really good ideas and really made development better. But if I were to say right now, today in 2018, let's do it this way, I would frankly be wrong. And my very skilled coworkers would tell me so. And here's a few things that at their time really made development better, but are probably not really things that you probably want to be using too much now. If I look back, jQuery is one of the first of them. And like I say, I'm not here to diss on jQuery, but jQuery really made incompatible differences in DOM implementations and DOM APIs not something that you had to deal with, and that was great. But as the DOM APIs have standardized, as frameworks have kind of given us better tools. If you're using Angular or React, certainly, but you find yourself reaching for jQuery in your React application, it's probably time to think whether you really need to do that. It's probably the wrong way to go. Um, Similarly, I was a huge fan and proponent of CoffeeScript. And CoffeeScript as a language was a vast improvement over the JavaScript of that day. Um, but what happened is some of the best, really all of the best features that I loved most about CoffeeScript, they drove innovation in the JavaScript language and made it into ES6 and ES 2016 and on. And really all the best ideas from CoffeeScript have since been incorporated into the ECMAScript language, along with some other really awesome ideas like modules that are new to the ECMAScript language. And at this point, if someone were to say like, I want to build my app in CoffeeScript, I would say, yeah, don't do that. And I loved me some CoffeeScript. It's just that, it's time to move on. So I feel like really this is the case now. And in a few years, we're going to look back and go, if you're using a framework that has its own proprietary incompatible component model, yes, I am looking at you, React. You should probably think about that and probably not go that direction. So, obviously there's plenty of people who will disagree with me, and that's fine. But this is what my experience, I feel like, is telling me. I feel like I've seen this before. I'm seeing it again. And if it's like last time, this is kind of how it goes down. So that said, let's talk about where I would like to see web development go. My vision for web development utopia, easy for me to say, if you will. At the top of that list is truly cross-browser, of course, and also cross-framework or cross-library, whichever word you like best, reusable components. And I feel like we have that as a viable option today, and I'm going to get into that quite a bit. The other thing I feel like we can have that's really excellent is truly semantic HTML, or what I like to call semantic or HTML. And I'll have a demo of that in a little bit. I really do want manageable data flow, the idea of data coming into my components via their attributes, props, if you want to call them that, API, and they are emitting events, and it's somebody else's job to take those events in the current state and decide what the new state is. That's a pretty good way to build apps, and I feel like we should keep doing it that way. And then of course testability. I want to be able to test drive my web apps with whatever libraries, etc. I'm using. And standard packaging and distribution. At this point, I think NPM is pretty much a settled thing, and that's the way we should be doing it. But also fully embracing the module system of JavaScript, which is a really vast improvement. So let's talk about some of the standards that can start getting us there. And really, I'm going to talk a lot about web components because they're really kind of the linchpin of a lot of this. Web component standards, they're kind of the web component spec is kind of an umbrella spec that incorporates other specs. And I'll dig into these a little bit. But the main ones here that are really relevant for us today, the custom element spec is certainly the most important one. And custom elements, quite simply, give us the ability to introduce our own HTML elements into our browser and specify what the behavior of those HTML elements is. And for me, this is a thing that I've wanted and waited for, believe it or not, for 20 plus years. Back when I was in college, ancient eons ago, when we had just stone tablets to code on in the 90s, when I first saw the web, which was a brand new thing, I started learning HTML. There was no CSS, but learning HTML and the browsers and how things worked, one of my first questions was like, okay, cool, I have these set of HTML tags. I would like to write my own now to do something. And I was very frustrated that there was no way to do that. And it only took 20 years of waiting, but we can finally write our own HTML elements, which maybe is more exciting for me than other people, but I feel like it is a great way forward in terms of building web apps. And it's a great way to work with designers too, if you have designers on your team and you separate or have designers and developers working together. One of the other specs is really something that can enable even more powers in terms of writing these custom elements, and that's the shadow DOM spec. Notice there's a V1 next to both of these specs. That's important. They've actually both gone through a revision. There was a V0 of both of these specs that was implemented at least in Chrome, but really didn't catch on as much in the other browsers. At this point, V1 is the version of this spec that has the widespread community support and is adopted in the most browsers and has very good stable polyfills for the browsers that don't have it yet. HTML templates is a spec that basically just gives us an element to hold templates. And I'm not going to talk about it a whole lot. It's interesting and useful, but not super interesting necessarily. Custom events, though, custom events is a spec that's implemented in actually all the browsers now. It's not officially part of the web components umbrella spec. The reason I have it in here is using custom events gives me a way to satisfy some of my goals in terms of how I want to do web app development. And I'll show you an example of that a little later on. Good news is these specs have been at least not implemented in all the browsers, but committed to by all the browsers, and both Chrome and Firefox have support for custom elements and shadow DOM. Microsoft, it's on their list, but even now, with the web components JS polyfill, there's very good support for these, regardless of whether your browser has it yet. So let's talk about custom elements a little bit more. Like I said, these let you make your own custom elements, HTML elements. You can define their behavior and presentation. The way it works is you create ES6 classes that extend from HTML elements. There are definitely some ES6 class haters out there. You do have to do it this way, but there are some libraries that give you a functional veneer over that, so you never have to look at ES6 classes or touch them yourself if that's distasteful to you. Once you have a HTML element of your own, the way that you actually register it with your browser is there is a custom elements object on window, and you call define, and you give it the tag name and an implementation. So here in this example, we're making a new custom element my-tag and giving it the my-tag element class. Custom elements do have to have a dash in their tag name, and that is so that your browser can tell them apart from built-in HTML elements. Everybody hearing me? Any questions so far? Audio okay?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, I'll keep rolling. Just not used to not having the feedback from a live audience. But anyway, custom element lifecycle methods. So of course, defining a class for your custom element is all well and good, but that doesn't really tell you how to tell your custom element what to do. And the way that you define the behavior custom element is with the custom element lifecycle methods. You get a constructor. Your browser will construct a new instance and call your constructor for each instance on the page. There's a couple callbacks that's generally where you want to do your work. The third one, connected callback, is the hook which is called when your custom element is actually wired up into the DOM. And that's usually where you want to do most of your rendering work. There's also an attribute changed callback, and that's really handy as an API for triggering re-render. So you can get notified when your attributes changed, in which case you might have more or different data coming into your custom element, and it might be time to re-render. There's a few other callbacks that I'm not going to go into, but those are kind of the most important for our purposes. And here's a code example, kind of the very simplest hello world custom element that I could come up with. You have the ES6 class that extends HTML element, and I'm doing nothing but implementing custom connected callback, excuse me. And because I am an HTML element, on this, I can just set my inner HTML property to hello world. And then after I have my class completed, I need to call custom elements defined. I'm giving it a tag name of hello-world, and the implementation is the hello world class I just defined. In order to then use that in my page, I have a script tag. I'm using the module script type. That's a new feature that I think at least the modern browsers have added support for, that lets me use JavaScript modules in my page. I'm importing hello world. Oh, and I've got a little typo there where I have custom elements defined happening twice. But then in my body, I have a single hello world tag, and the result of all this should be, oops, that is the wrong demo, sorry about that. If I go to hello world, I see hello world on the screen. And sure enough, if I inspect that guy, I see that there is a hello world element that has its inner HTML set to hello world. So pretty simple so far, I think. Just was going to show you that script stuff is what I said it was. All right, that's hello world. Let's talk about Shadow DOM next. As I like to call it, the spooky Shadow DOM. Not really. The Shadow DOM is a really cool idea. It is basically giving you a DOM within a DOM that is kind of, it's really a completely separate DOM, and you kind of, by default, nothing leaks in and nothing leaks out. So I'm defining my own DOM within a DOM. And what it lets me do is get really precise control over the appearance of my custom elements. Because by default, none of the CSS classes from outside of the Shadow DOM are going to leak in, and none of the CSS I define in my Shadow DOM is going to leak out. So I have complete control over the appearance. Can't mess it up with colliding CSS classes, etc. I don't think I have this in here, but one of the really things I found super interesting about Shadow DOM is that when HTML5 came along and they added a bunch of new HTML elements into the browser, the way that browser vendors actually implemented those brand new custom elements is that they wrote those custom elements in HTML and CSS. And the way at least Chrome, and I assume other browsers, implemented that is they actually had Shadow DOM there, but they hadn't exposed it yet as an API that as a developer you could work with. So you can actually see this if you go and use some HTML5 elements and turn on the right settings in Chrome. You can actually see the internal DOM for things like the meter element and the video tag and different HTML5 elements, which is kind of cool from a nerdy point of view. But as a developer, I can use this to define my own custom elements with precise appearance control. The way it works, there's an attach shadow function that I call on element. It takes a single parameter that's an object that the only significant attribute I know about on that is mode. And mode open to tell you the truth, this is always what you want to use, and I'm not recalling immediately all the details on what mode closed does, but it kind of makes it really hard to even get in and work with a shadow DOM at all. So opens what you want. And when you call attach shadow, it's going to create a shadow root property of that element. And that shadow root is a totally encapsulated DOM within a DOM. And like I said, CSS doesn't leak in or out. This is what it looks like in code. I have a hello shadow element where I'm attaching a shadow. And then I'm setting the inner HTML not on my element, but on the shadow root. And you can see what that's doing. I'm defining some CSS in there. On my shadow class, I'm going to turn it gray and give it I'm going to give it a gray shadow, excuse me. And we can kind of see how this works together in a larger example. Oh, here's the markup from this example. So I basically have some CSS outside of the shadow DOM to turn my H1s red. But as you'll see in a second, even though there's an H1 inside of the hello shadow, it's not going to be red. And let me prove it to you like so. We have an H1 that's outside of the shadow element, and that is red, but inside the shadow, you do have that CSS class with the shadow, but it doesn't turn red. And here's what all that looks like. Oops. Hello shadow, and you can actually see the shadow root and what it has inside of it. And I'm using the class shadow in both cases just to prove that it doesn't leak in and it doesn't leak out. Alrighty, so that's the shadow DOM. Well, that's part of the shadow DOM. So the other really cool thing about the shadow DOM is composition and slots. So slots are a feature of the shadow DOM spec that lets you use the shadow DOM as a template. And it gets a little complicated, but I'm going to walk through it with an example. Essentially, you can create an element and have other markup within that element. And that is called your light DOM. Your element through that connected callback can add its own shadow DOM. And that, as we've already seen, is called the shadow DOM. And what slots and composition are about is it kind of lets you smurge the light DOM and the shadow DOM. And how it exactly works is the light DOM, that's the markup from the page that isn't declared within your element. That light DOM is going to be rendered into a slot that you define in your shadow DOM. And I realize this might not make sense in words, so let's look at it in code and hopefully it will. So this is a very simple hello slots example that I've created. And same as before, I'm creating a shadow and setting the shadow roots inner HTML, but the difference here is I am defining in my shadow DOM a slot element. And as I said, hopefully I explained it, the slot element is like the placeholder, and that is where the light DOM is going to get rendered into the shadow DOM. So let's see an example of what a light DOM even is. So I've got my hello slots custom element, I'm defining it, and then I'm using my hello slots custom element, and I'm doing something we haven't done yet. I'm actually putting markup inside my custom element. That markup inside the custom element is the light DOM. And the light DOM is going to get rendered into the shadow DOM at the slot. So hopefully it's probably obvious what's going to happen, but let's show you the example. And Momentum is the conference I gave this last time. Sorry guys, if I was on the ball, I would have changed this to Anywhere.js, but you get the idea. And I have hello slots with momentum peeps in it. And then the shadow DOM is going to populate my slot with the light DOM. And you can see it's got sort of a reference to the light DOM from the slot. So composition and slots are super interesting. There's kind of a lot more to it than I have time to get to in a talk. Since I'm already half an hour in, I want to keep it moving, but there's a lot more to it. It's worth reading up on, but the basics of it let you use a shadow DOM as a template and make elements that have content passed into them. So one of the things that you can do with the shadow DOM and composition and slots that I thought was super interesting is what I have decided to call semantic or markup. So we've all heard of this idea of semantic markup, which is just basically trying to use tags based on their intrinsic meaning. So when I need a paragraph, I should use a p tag because a p tag means paragraph. When I use a list, I should use a list tag instead of a div styled like a list, that kind of thing. But what happens, of course, is like, I don't necessarily have in my application all of the tags that have the meaning that I want. So eventually you can only get so semantic with your markup. What you can do with Shadow DOM, though, is really define the tags to be exactly what you mean and be as semantic as you want them to be. So in order to show this off, I built a little tiny app that's just a checklist for if you're, I've been learning to be a pilot, so most of my examples revolve around this idea. And this is a little pre-flight checklist app that I made for myself. And when I started, I was just sort of using bootstrap styling as one does. And this is the kind of markup that I would end up with to do the bootstrap thing. So not very semantic at all, but this is what it took to get the list item with a checklist in it that I wanted. But if I wanted like truly semantic markup, it would be really cool if I could do something like this. If I could just have a flight checklist element. And inside of that, I could have a checklist item for each item in my checklist. And with Shadow DOM and slots and composition, I can actually do that. So I thought I'd show you what that looks like. And I might already have this open, but here is actually the outcome of all this. So this is my checklist. This is using bootstrap styles. And if you actually see it under the covers, the actual markup on the page is a flight checklist item with a name at the top and checklist items within them. And each of these guys, the flight checklist and the checklist items, are using shadow DOMs. Let's see, how am I doing on time? So I'll try to show this code, but I'll probably go fairly fast through it. Let's see, do I already have this open? I might. That's not where we are yet. Oh, I guess I don't, sorry. 1 second. So my checklist, this is the checklist itself. And basically what I'm doing is that I'm defining that H2 at the top. I'm defining the unordered list. And then I have just slot. And that takes in the light DOM, which is those checklist items. In those checklist items, they in turn have a shadow DOM of their own. And that's where all of that same kind of noisy markup that Bootstrap makes me use is hidden in that checklist item tag. And I have my checkbox and my label. And then finally, I have another slot in here, which just holds the text for my checklist item. So by using shadow DOM and slots, I can really make up my own tags and have them be as semantic as I want, which is pretty cool, I think. All right, moving on. Let's talk about data flow next for the remaining bit of time we have. So this diagram is from Flux, and it's just kind of showing what Flux looks like. I have actions that go into a dispatcher, which update a store, and then turn around and update my view. And my thought was, so first of all, in fairness, really, this idea was pioneered by the React community, Flux, and it really probably, you could go back and say Elm probably really takes credit for it, but Redux is kind of the most common implementation of Flux, and you can totally use Redux without React. It is completely neutral, and you could actually use Redux with web components, and people are doing that. Polymer has an implementation of using Redux with web components. It works great. But as I kind of pushed in, my first thought was like, okay, I could use Redux, but do I really need to? And I just kind of questioned myself and tried to think of what are the ideas, what are really the essential ideas of Flux and Redux? And could I implement those ideas with standards that are already in the browser? And I decided that I could, and I'll show you an example of what I came up with. And really the core of the matter for how this works is this idea of custom events. So my key, I guess, idea is that rather than having to use actions, which are entirely, I guess, really specific to Redux if they're Redux actions, what if instead of actions, which really, if you squint just even a tiny bit, are events to me, what if I just used custom events, which are built into the browser in place of actions? Custom events, like I said, they're not really part of web components, but they're just what the name implies. I can make up my own custom event with its own event name, and I can also give it a payload that's just an arbitrary JavaScript object, and that goes in the detail properties. So I'm essentially using custom events in place of actions if I was in Flux land. And this is kind of the experiment that I came up with. I built an app, like I said, using only browser provided APIs. I didn't end up using a build tool at all. I'm using web components written in another framework, so kind of off the shelf. One of my goals was I wanted to see if it's really practical to use web components written in some other library together in an app with web components that don't use a library or framework at all. And then of course I wanted to understand how to manage data flow within my app in a sensible way. So the example I came up with is a little flight planner app. And Flight Planner is a very simple aviation app that lets you plan a flight between two airports. And this is not running. Whoops. Okay, I probably got to start something else. I thought I had it running. Give me 1 second here. Okay, I'll just open another tab. And start it up. And this is what it looks like. So what we are looking at here is called a sectional chart. And a sectional chart is a map for pilots. And instead of showing you things that you care about if you're driving a car, they show you things you care about if you're driving a plane. All these little red things with lines are airports. There's data like what frequency and what runways and how long the runways are and what, where to turn your radios to get what information. And there's other things like these blue lines denote airspace, which is really important because it turns out if I'm flying to CVG in a little plane, I could run into a big plane, and planes running into each other is bad. They frown on that. So I'm not allowed to get too close to that airport unless I let people know what I'm doing and talk to air traffic controllers and that kind of thing. Don't need to go into too much detail about sectional charts. I think they're interesting, but you may not. For now, let's see what this app does. Let's type in my airport that I fly out of, which is Butler County Regional Airport. Oops, that's not it. It's over here, Butler County Regional Airport. And let's say I want to fly over here to Batesville. The identifier for Batesville is HLB. I have to put a K in front of it because I do. That's just a thing. And what this will do is go and look up the latitude and longitude for these airports and overlay a line between the two airports. So it's actually going out, when I enter that data, it's actually going out doing a couple fetches from another API that takes an airport identifier and gets the lat long from it, and using that information to overlay on my map. And I'm using Leaflet as the mapping solution for doing this. And Leaflet actually had an implementation of letting me use sectional chart tiles. So let's see the code and talk about how all this fits together, because that's what you guys are going to be most interested in. And this is the app. We'll start with, well, it starts with index.html. That's probably always where to start. And I've broken this up into several components that work together. I have the flight nav component. That's actually the map itself. I have the route form. That's where I type in the two airports. I have a component for that spinner that you saw while it was fetching data. And then containers, not actually a component. Containers kind of where I put the logic to manage the state for the app. I actually just have the body tag, just having my components with the route form, the route spinner, and the flight nav. So let's just go top down. We'll start from route form. Route form does actually create a shadow DOM. I'm actually creating it in the constructor because I don't want to create it over and over again in render. And then I'm calling render right from the constructor. So I could have done that in connected callback. In my render method, I'm actually just setting the inner HTML of my shadow root to that form that I have up there. And then I'm listening to an event on that form. Specifically, I'm listening to the click for this button. And then inside of that button click, I'm actually creating a custom event, and that's what it looks like. I'm creating a custom event specific to my application named route selected. I'm telling it that it can bubble up so that I can catch it in a higher up element. And then that payload is in detail, and my payload object just has a from and a to, and these are both just whatever I typed into those form elements. So really all this element does, he doesn't actually even re-render. He just emits an event when something happens. So this is kind of actions up, I guess you would say. He emits an action. Next, let's look at flight nav. Flight nav is a little bit more interesting. Flight nav is actually the map, and he has data that's passed in that will change what gets rendered. And the way that works, I mentioned earlier that there's an attribute change callback. One thing that I forgot to have in my slides there, in order for attribute change callback to be called, you need to define what attributes you want to observe. In this case, I'm just going to observe the route attribute. And that route attribute, I'm defining a custom getter. I expect that route attribute to get set with JSON that represents the route. And in my getter, I'm actually going to parse that. So basically what happens in my render, that's where I'm actually using custom elements that I didn't write in this app. So I'm trying to sort of experiment with the custom element or web component ecosystem here a little bit. And I'm using this leaflet map custom element, which in turn uses other custom elements. It has a leaflet tile layer, and this is what tells it to use the sectional chart layer instead of out of the box. It would just, use roads. And then here is where I'm actually using a line on that map. And so what happens is it will render every time that route attribute changes. If that route attribute changes such that it actually, exists, it will assume that route element the route object is going to have a from property with a latitude and a to property with a latitude and longitude. And it's just going to draw a line between those 2 points. I have one custom element left, and that's also a very dumb custom element. And it's basically just using another spinner element that I didn't write, I just brought into my app. And this custom element is basically just going to display that spinner or not based on whether the finding route property is set. So I have one custom element, route form, that emits events. I have two other custom elements that take data in through their attributes. That's all of my custom element code. Of course, the next question is, well, how does that actually work to actually build an app? And the way this actually fits together is I've defined a small bit of JavaScript code that I'm jokingly calling Redux-ish, that basically takes the custom events and hands them off, that basically uses reducers to change the state and then pass the state back into the custom elements. So I'm going to show you what it looks like to use Redux-ish first, and then I'll walk through actually the code itself. It's only 30 lines, so hopefully it won't take too long. This is actually the reducers for the app itself. And the way I've defined reducers is reducers are kind of by convention have the same name as the event that they care about. So I'm defining, looks like two reducers, a route selected reducer and a route found reducer. And in my route selected reducer, and this gets triggered by the route selected custom element, it's just a function that takes the current state and the payload from the route selected event. It goes out and does fetches to an airport lookup API. It does fetches for the from and the to, and then I'm using promise to kind of bundle those together and listen to both of them together. And when I get back the from and to data about the airport, I turn around and dispatch another custom event called route found. So basically, this is a thunk in Redux parlance. It's an asynchronous reducer. And this is the asynchronous part. When that promise finally resolves, I'll dispatch that route found event. But when it's first going to go through, it's going to immediately return a new state, and the new state is the old state with a finding route property set to true. So route select is going to get called. It's going to initiate these requests, and it's going to set the finding route to true, which is going to trigger the spinner to start spinning. Later on, presumably, if things all go well, there'll be another route found event that'll happen later, and route found is going to return a new state, and that new state is going to be the old state with finding route set to false and the route data that it got added to it. So that will trigger the spinner to stop spinning, and it will also trigger the map to overlay that line because now it has the data. Subscribers is just a very simple concept that basically it defines CSS selectors and functions that will get called when the state changes. So I'm saying that the flight nav custom element should get called when the state changes. It'll get past the new state. It'll get past the element that matches the selector. And this is actually what sets the route attribute of that flight nav element. And it does it just by calling set attribute. The route spinner also subscribes to state, so that when state change happens, it gets past the current state, a reference to the route spinner element, and it just can call set attribute like so. Connect is a function that I've defined, and that's really the entry point to Reduxish. Reduxish is just 27 lines of JavaScript. I don't really intend this to be a library per se. It's really just sort of a spike or an experiment. I just wanted to see if I could do what I'm trying to do, basically just by using things that are there in the browser already. And the guts is just this connect, which takes reducers, subscribers, and initial state. And basically, it's just defining an event listener for each custom event that a reducer that's defined in the system. And it's going to invoke the reducer when it gets the corresponding custom event. And then the reducer is going to return a new state. It's then going to turn around and emit another custom event that's not application specific. It's just the event that I've defined in Reduxish. I've called state change. So it gets a new state, and it just broadcasts the state changed by emitting a state change custom event. That's all. For subscribers, they're not really doing very much either. All subscribers do is they listen to state change. And they listen to state change, they look up the element that goes with that subscription, and they call the function passing in the new state and the element. So very little, but it gives me just enough that I can have my components be really, really dumb. My components just take state via their attributes, and they emit events. That's all. They have no state management logic and no binding or anything like that. So let's see, I'm getting really close to the hour. So that's really, there's definitely some other things that I kind of have into here that I'll kind of just make reference to really, really briefly. But this was really the core of the matter for me. Is the outcome of this experiment for me is I felt like web components are a viable way to build an app. I felt like managing state in an app that's built out of web components was doable. Could I have used Redux? Absolutely. And you can if you choose to, nothing wrong with that. But I didn't feel like I needed to, and that was interesting too. I'm not going to have time to talk about testing too much. Testing web components, that's a really interesting topic too. So, well, I don't have time to go into too much detail, which is sad. It's really important. And the 2-second pitch is Puppeteer is your friend. Puppeteer is a new framework that comes out of the Chrome, which gives you a headless, it gives you an API for headless Chrome, which means I can write my unit tests headless. They can interact with real browser APIs, so I can fully test my web components, but they can be fast and headless, which is what I want. So there's a couple different things wrapped around Puppeteer. There's Mocha Puppeteer, and there's Mocha Headless Chrome. Those are 2 different NPMs that you might want to look at. Right now, I'm kind of leaning towards Mocha Headless Chrome. It's not perfect, but I like it just a little bit better. So I'm not going to dig into the test example because I'm kind of running out of time. But there are lots of things in this space worth checking out. Just a few shout outs, webcomponents.org. Polymer, especially the new version of Polymer, has really kind of like, they keep going the direction of like, what can we just use in standards and not invent ourselves, which is really admirable in my opinion. And some of their latest ideas in Polymer 3, they're fully embracing NPM. They have this idea called lit HTML, which is a tiny little library to make rendering better and faster and more performant. There's another library called skate.js, which is also a little syntax goodness around web components. And there are a few other libraries that make web components, I guess, easier to write. Stencil's another one. So there's definitely a number of libraries and frameworks, if you want to call them that, are all kind of converging towards standard web components, and something I'm really excited about. I hope I've made my case and gotten you excited about them too. And at this point, I'll kind of stop talking and open it up for questions.
Yes, and we do have a hard stop. They just informed me they're going to turn my power off at my house because they're working on the power lines.
Oh no.
We'll try to make that work. Jay did ask, what will custom elements be supported in email clients as well? And that maybe I had another question as well. Like I looked up while you were talking, can I use? And it looks like web components version 0 and version 1 seem to only really be supported by Chrome. So
I think they are now supported in Firefox, I at least behind a flag, but I thought they had dropped. I'd have to look that up. But I would definitely say that the polyfill web components JS will bring support to all of the modern browsers for you.
Okay, awesome. Is that fairly small, you think, or have you looked at the size of it?
As I recall, it is quite small, but I don't have like the off the top of my head data there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fine.
That's not taking me right to the polymer. Anyway, you can look it up. But yeah, they've definitely worked hard to make it really small. And there are a few different versions of it depending on which browsers you want to support and what they actually have, so that it can be even smaller.
Awesome. That is kind of exciting. So your flight planner app felt an awful lot like Redux and React app, and I suppose that wasn't at all a coincidence.
Nope.
Have you thought at all about like what happens? Like, can a framework just adopt web components as like its output in the long run? Do you think that's a feasible thing that we'll see happen?
Totally. Like you could, and you know, if you wanted to, you could kind of use Redux as your state management and just use plain vanilla web components as your component layer, with or without any library at all. Like you could totally build an app that way. Polymer.js has some examples in their new version where they have this a thing called a lit element, which is really much lighter weight than polymer elements used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, it's just like giving you a more performant solution for rendering, and it's giving you out of the box like property and attribute monitoring. So instead of having to like instead of having to add those attribute change stuff that I did, it would just come for free. And their example apps use Redux for state management and lit element to give you just a little syntax sugar around custom elements. And they have some examples of building apps that way that I think are interesting.
Nice. That's awesome. I also I was Googling around too to try to figure this out myself, and I found out that there's a Vue web component since
Mm-hmm.
Vue's the big thing today since they just passed React and GitHub stars, which is
No
apparently,
way.
yeah,
That's funny.
there's a big thing on Twitter last night and this morning. But anyway, they have a web component output, so you can just like wrap it in this little Vue web component wrapper, and it'll
Yep.
spit out web components for you. So.
Yeah, I was actually sort of thinking about playing with that at some point. Ironically, in some ways, Vue.js was the inspiration for this whole experiment. And this is nothing to knock Vue at all, but I saw Vue come along and start getting popular, and I was just like, great, here's another incompatible web framework. I can't even. And that's kind of where the experiment started. But it is cool that they're adding support for taking your Vue app and kind of turning it into a custom element. And that is pretty interesting.
Yeah. All right. On that note, I want to say thank you, Chris, for giving this talk. It was awesome.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for everyone watching on the live stream. I will be emailing and tweeting out the finished video. I don't know how that all works with YouTube. I may just edit the one that's there. Anyway, uh, in 2 weeks, we're going to do this every 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, we're going to have Jen Luker on. I think that's how you say her last name. I hope I got that right. She's from, oh man, I'm drawing a blank now that I got to remember it. Formidable Labs, and they've done quite a bit of work and in the React community. And she's going to be talking about accessibility and
Ooh, cool.
like a bunch of interesting topics around that, which I didn't prior to being at my current client Kroger. I'd never worked with accessibility stuff, and I think it's like super important.
So many of
So
us need to learn more about that.
yes, for sure. And then after that, incidentally, we'll have uh, 2 consecutive talks that'll be on Vue.js. So if you want to learn about that, we'll have
Interesting.
some topics on that as well. So
Cool.
uh, stay tuned to email and Twitter, and I'll let you guys know about that. But thanks again for watching, everyone.